Good evening, everyone. Tonight we will enter the world of quiet gardens and whispered secrets, where the gentle clinking of teacups can mask the sharp sting of betrayal, and the most commonplace social gathering can become a stage for unspeakable tragedy. In the heart of a picturesque English village, beneath a seemingly tranquil sky, an act of darkness is about to unfold. Prepare yourselves to observe, to ponder, and to wonder, as we delve into a mystery where every polite smile hides a potential motive and every casual remark holds a key. For in St. Mary Mead, nothing is quite as it seems, and the sharpest eyes often belong to those least expected. Now let's start with the first chapter of Death at the Afternoon Tea. Chapter 1. The Invitation and the Whisper. The late spring air in St. Mary Mead carried the scent of newly blossomed roses and damp earth, a comforting aroma that usually heralded long, peaceful afternoons. However, for Miss Jane Marple, the gentle breezes seemed to carry something else. This particular year, a faint undercurrent of unease, a subtle shift in the village's otherwise placid rhythm. It began, as many things did, with an invitation. A heavy cream-colored envelope, formally addressed, arrived one Tuesday morning, bearing the crest of Cavendish Manor. It was, of course, from Mrs. Evelyn Cavendish, announcing her annual afternoon tea. Mrs. Cavendish was, by general consensus, the most formidable woman in St. Mary Mead. Wealthy, opinionated, and possessed of a formidable memory for perceived slights, her tea parties were less social gatherings and more mandatory inspections. To be invited was an honor. To decline was to risk social ostracization. Miss Marple, an old maid with a deceptively gentle demeanor, understood the intricate dance of village society better than most. She knew that behind the polite smiles and murmurs of anticipation, there lay a complex tapestry of grudges, aspirations, and long-held secrets. As she carefully unfolded the stiff card, her blue eyes, though mild, held a glint of their customary perceptiveness. Cavendish Manor, Saturday, 3 o'clock, she read aloud to herself, a soft sigh escaping her lips. I do hope young Miss Thorne has managed to improve Mrs. Cavendish's chamomile blend this year. Last year's was rather bracing. Miss Beatrice Thorne was Mrs. Cavendish's companion, a quiet, almost spectral figure who hovered perpetually in the matriarch's shadow, her nervousness as palpable as the scent of lavender in the drawing-room. Later that morning, during her customary walk to the village shop, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Gribble, the postmistress, whose ear was, by virtue of her profession, a receptacle for all village whispers. "Going to the Cavendish tea, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Gribble asked, her eyes sparkling with unasked questions. "I heard Mrs. Cavendish had quite the set to with young Mr. Finch just last week. About the estate, you know. He's her nephew, but she's never quite approved of his rather extravagant ways." Miss Marple nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. Mr. Alistair Finch, Mrs. Cavendish's only living relative and primary heir, was a charming but somewhat feckless young man, perpetually in need of funds. A familiar pattern, Miss Marple mused, recalling a similar situation in Little Paddocks, though the outcome there had been far less, civil. Further along she noticed a new face in the village, a man working in Mrs. Cavendish's extensive gardens. He was tall, gaunt, with an unusually intense gaze that seemed to linger on the manor house itself, rather than the flower beds he was tending. He paused, wiping his brow with a grimy hand, and looked up as Miss Marple passed. His eyes, a striking shade of gray, held a peculiar sort of watchfulness, almost predatory. Miss Marple felt a shiver, an illogical premonition that this man, the new gardener, Mr. Silas Croft, might play a more significant role in the forthcoming events than simply cultivating Mrs. Cavendish's prize-winning dahlias. It was an unsettling detail, a discordant note in the otherwise peaceful village symphony, and Miss Marple filed it away. along with Mrs. Gribble's gossip, for later consideration. The stage, she felt, was being subtly set. Chapter 2. A Gathering of Grudges. Saturday afternoon arrived cloaked in a veil of deceptive sunshine. Cavendish Manor, an imposing Georgian edifice nestled amidst manicured lawns, buzzed with a tense, polite energy. Inside, the drawing-room, usually a sanctuary of chintz and faded grandeur, was now a theater of forced pleasantries. Miss Marple, dressed in her sensible gray tweed, observed the scene from a strategically chosen armchair near the window, her knitting needles clicking a silent counterpoint to the polite chatter. Mrs. Evelyn Cavendish, resplendent in a gown of deep emerald velvet, held court from her favorite high-backed chair. Her sharp eyes, missing nothing, swept across the room, assessing, scrutinizing, and occasionally dismissing. Her companion, Miss Beatrice Thorne, a wisp of a woman in a perpetually anxious state, hovered by the silver tea service, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. Miss Marple noticed a faint, almost imperceptible sheen of perspiration on Miss Thorne's forehead, despite the mild temperature of the room. Poor dear, she thought, it must be quite a strain, serving such a demanding mistress. Among the carefully assembled guests were the usual village luminaries and dependents. Mrs. Agatha Plum, the village's unofficial arbiter of social standing, sat stiffly on the sofa opposite Mrs. Cavendish, her face a mask of polite disdain. A long-standing rivalry, Miss Marple knew, dating back to some forgotten dispute over church fete arrangements decades ago. Mr. Alistair Finch, Mrs. Cavendish's nephew, was attempting to charm a group of unmarried ladies near the fireplace, his laughter a little too boisterous, his eyes constantly straying towards his aunt. There was an air of suppressed eagerness about him, like a coiled spring. Dr. Reginald Ashworth, the kindly village doctor, sat beside Miss Marple, sipping his tea with a resigned air. He and Mrs. Cavendish shared a history, a brief, youthful courtship that had ended abruptly, leaving the doctor with a quiet dignity and Mrs. Cavendish with a lingering, almost teasing possessiveness. Evelyn always did enjoy her grand occasions, he murmured to Miss Marple, a melancholic note in his voice, though one often feels like a specimen under her microscope rather than a guest. Suddenly, Mrs. Cavendish's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the room's gentle hum. "Alistair, dear boy," she boomed, fixing her nephew with a steely gaze, "I heard you've been contemplating another of your investments in those rather fanciful South African diamond mines. Do try to be more prudent with your meager inheritance. After all, what little you have left could quite easily evaporate." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Alistair's face flushed crimson, and he quickly mumbled a denial, his forced smile slipping. Mrs. Plum, not to be outdone, then interjected, "Indeed, Evelyn, prudence is a virtue often overlooked by the younger generation. Some of us, however, know the value of safeguarding one's legacy." Her words, ostensibly about financial wisdom, carried a clear barb aimed at Mrs. Cavendish's own rather public feuds over local land boundaries. The air thickened with unspoken resentments. Miss Marple observed Miss Thorne's hand shake so violently as she refilled Mrs. Cavendish's cup that a tiny splash of tea landed on the expensive Persian rug. Miss Thorne gasped, her eyes wide with terror, immediately dabbing at it with a serviette, her movements jerky and frantic. Mrs. Cavendish, however, did not notice, too engrossed in delivering another stinging remark to Mrs. Plum about her lack of taste in garden gnomes. It was a small incident, easily dismissed, but Miss Marple filed it away. Such intense fear over a spilled drop of tea seemed disproportionate, a sign of a deeper, more profound anxiety. The afternoon tea, she concluded, was a simmering pot, and the lid felt precariously loose. Chapter 3. The Fatal Sip. The polite skirmishes continued, a verbal fencing match over cups of Darjeeling and plates of cucumber sandwiches. Mrs. Cavendish, it seemed, was in particularly fine form, her wit as sharp as a newly honed blade and striking. at anyone who dared to cross her path. She held court with an almost regal air, her gaze imperious, her pronouncements final. Miss Marple watched, her mild eyes missing nothing, the patterns of human behavior so familiar to her from years of observation. The subtle flinch of Miss Thorne every time Mrs. Cavendish addressed her, the barely concealed irritation in Mrs. Plum's pursed lips, the feigned nonchalance of Alistair Finch, whose nervous fingers drummed a silent rhythm on the arm of his chair. A hush fell over the room as Mrs. Cavendish reached for her teacup. It was a delicate porcelain creation, adorned with tiny bluebirds, part of a set she particularly cherished. Miss Thorne, having just refilled it, had placed it carefully on the small side table next to Mrs. Cavendish's chair, along with a silver sugar bowl and a plate of shortbread. Mrs. Cavendish picked up a sugar cube with elegant silver tongs, dropped it into her tea, and stirred it with a tiny, almost theatrical flourish. A moment of silence, broken only by the faint clink of porcelain. She brought the cup to her lips, took a slow, deliberate sip. Her eyes, which had been fixed on Mrs. Plum with a triumphant glint, suddenly widened. A faint gasp escaped her. Her hand, still holding the cup, began to tremble violently, spilling a trickle of tea down the front of her emerald gown. Her other hand flew to her chest, clutching at the velvet fabric as if in sudden, unbearable pain. Her face, which had been so ruddy with robust health moments before, turned a ghastly shade of gray. A strangled cough, a low guttural sound ripped from her throat. The bluebird teacup clattered to the floor, shattering into a dozen fragments. Mrs. Cavendish's body stiffened, then slumped forward. Her head lolled to one side, her eyes staring blankly at the ornate pattern of the rug. A collective gasp rose from the assembled guests. A scone, half-eaten, dropped from Mrs. Plum's hand onto her lap. Dr. Ashworth, ever the professional, was the first to react. He sprang from his seat, rushing to Mrs. Cavendish's side. He knelt, fumbling for her pulse, his face grim. After a moment he looked up, his expression one of profound shock. She's gone," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good heavens, it appears to be heart failure." But it was so sudden. Chaos erupted. A woman shrieked. "Alistair!" Finch, who had been standing near the tea trolley, his back momentarily turned, spun around, his face a mixture of shock and, Miss Marple noted, something else. A fleeting expression she couldn't quite decipher, a kind of controlled surprise. Miss Thorne let out a choked cry, her small frame trembling uncontrollably, and collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Mrs. Plum sat frozen, her teacup still clutched in her hand, her eyes wide with horrified fascination. Miss Marple, though startled, remained outwardly calm. Her eyes, however, were like a hawk's, taking in every detail, the shattered teacup, the fallen sugar tongs, the small pool of tea spreading on the rug, the rigid stillness of Mrs. Cavendish. She also noticed Alistair Finch's subtle movement. A slight, almost imperceptible adjustment of his jacket, as if he were smoothing down something that had been disturbed. It was a tiny detail easily overlooked in the ensuing pandemonium, but for Miss Marple it was a piece of a puzzle, a thread in a tapestry that had just been violently torn. The afternoon tea had, indeed, become an afternoon of death. Chapter 4. Initial Inquiries and Suspicion. The arrival of Constable Hemlock brought a semblance of order to the drawing-room, though the air remained thick with shock and barely suppressed hysteria. Constable Hemlock, a diligent but somewhat unimaginative officer, did his best to control the distraught guests, ushering them into separate rooms for preliminary questioning. Miss Marple, however, was allowed to remain, her quiet presence often overlooked, or rather underestimated. She used this to her advantage, listening with an almost preternatural calm to the fragmented conversations and hushed theories that circulated like smoke. Dr. Ashworth, having recovered his professional composure, confirmed his initial diagnosis to Constable Hemlock, a sudden, catastrophic heart attack. But the symptoms, he added, his brow furrowed, the speed of it all. It was unusually swift, almost as if something had precipitated it. He looked uneasy, casting a wary glance towards the empty chair where Mrs. Cavendish had sat. Constable Hemlock, following procedure, began to question everyone present. Miss Beatrice Thorne, pale and trembling, could barely articulate a coherent sentence. She recounted the events leading up to Mrs. Cavendish's collapse in a disjointed fashion, her voice barely a whisper. I just poured the tea, just as always. She asked for 2 sugars. I put the sugar bowl down. I turned to get more shortbread. And then, it was dreadful. Her distress seemed genuine, her fear palpable. Alistair Finch, on the other hand, was outwardly composed, if a little pale. He offered his condolences with an appropriate solemnity, expressing his shock and sorrow. My poor aunt, so sudden. We were just discussing her plans for the spring. Fate only moments before. Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing, the slightly too perfect narrative. She recalled the fleeting, unreadable expression on his face immediately after Mrs. Cavendish's collapse. Mrs. Agatha Plum, though still visibly shaken, quickly regained her composure, her sharp tongue reasserting itself. Heart attack, you say? Well, with Evelyn's temperament, it's hardly surprising. She always did lead a very excitable life. Though, she added, lowering her voice conspiratorially to a neighboring guest, some might say such a sudden departure is rather convenient for certain individuals. Her eyes flickered towards Alistair Finch, who was now conversing quietly with Dr. Ashworth. Constable Hemlock, inspecting the scene, noticed something glinting on the plush carpet near where Mrs. Cavendish's hand had fallen. He bent down and carefully picked it up. It was a small, intricately carved silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful. It was about the size of a shilling, clearly very old. Did anyone see this before? He asked, holding it up. Does anyone recognize it? A ripple of confusion went through the room. No one claimed it. Miss Thorne shook her head, her eyes wide with bewilderment. Mrs. Plum declared she'd never seen Mrs. Cavendish wear such a trinket. Alistair Finch examined it closely, then shrugged. Can't say I have, Constable. Aunt Evelyn preferred bolder jewels, not sentimental baubles like this. Miss Marple's mild gaze settled on the locket. A faint, almost imperceptible flicker of recognition passed through her. She remembered seeing a similar piece decades ago under rather tragic circumstances. But what was it doing here now? And why was it found so near Mrs. Cavendish's hand, as if it had fallen from her grasp in her final moments? It felt like a small, unexpected thread pulled from the fabric of the scene, a detail that didn't quite fit, hinting at a hidden layer beneath the surface of a simple heart attack. The mystery, Miss Marple realized, had just deepened. Chapter 5. Unraveling. Threads. The locket became the immediate focus of Constable Hemlock's investigation. Its presence, unexplained and unexpected, complicated the initial verdict of natural causes. Dr. Ashworth, upon further examination of Mrs. Cavendish's body, conceded that while a heart attack was plausible, the speed and severity of the collapse, coupled with the strange locket, warranted a more thorough inquiry. The possibility of poison, though horrific to contemplate in St. Mary Mead, was now openly discussed. Miss Marple, back in her cottage, spent a quiet evening considering the locket. It was indeed a peculiar object. The silver was deeply oxidized, suggesting it had been untouched for a very long time. Yet it had been found right next to Mrs. Cavendish. She recalled the faint flicker of recognition from Chapter 4. The locket reminded her of a story from her youth. Old Mr. Evans, the village clockmaker, had once made a similar, very distinctive locket for a young woman who was tragically jilted. These lockets were often meant to hold a miniature portrait or a lock of hair. The next morning, Constable Hemlock returned to Cavendish Manor for further questioning, accompanied by a more experienced detective inspector from the county force. Miss Marple, drawn by her intuition, decided to pay a call on Miss Thorne, ostensibly to offer condolences, but in truth to observe. She found Miss Thorne in the drawing room, tidying up the remnants of the tea party, her movements still jerky, her face pale. "My dear Miss Thorne," Miss Marple began gently, "a dreadful shock for you. How are you holding up?" Miss Thorne wrung her hands. "It's all so sudden. Mrs. Cavendish was difficult, yes, but she was a fixture. And now, this locket, no one knows it. It's almost as if it appeared out of thin air." She avoided Miss Marple's gaze, her eyes fixed on a rose in a vase. "Did you ever see Mrs. Cavendish wear such a piece?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but persistent. Miss Thorne hesitated, then shook her head vigorously. "Never. Mrs. Cavendish favored her emerald brooch or her pearl necklace. Something so plain, so old-fashioned. Not her style at all. Her denial was a little too emphatic, Miss Marple thought. It lacked the genuine bewilderment she would expect. Later that day, Miss Marple happened to encounter Alistair Finch near the village green. He appeared preoccupied, talking rapidly to the local estate agent. He looked considerably more haggard than the day before, a furtive anxiety replacing his earlier composure. Miss Marple heard snippets of their conversation. Urgent, substantial sum. Need the funds within the fortnight. Miss Marple's mind clicked. She recalled Mrs. Gribble's gossip about Alistair's financial troubles and Mrs. Cavendish's stinging public remark about his meager inheritance. It seemed Alistair's financial woes were far more pressing than anyone had realized. She also remembered the peculiar, almost too calm look on his face after Mrs. Cavendish collapsed and his subtle adjustment of his jacket. That evening, Constable Hemlock, looking rather pleased, informed Miss Marple that they had managed to open the locket. Inside, nestled beneath the tarnished silver, was a tiny, faded miniature portrait of a young man with dark, intense eyes and a rather romantic sweep of hair. He was clearly from a bygone era, perhaps the early 1900s. No one in the village recognized him, but it was a portrait without a doubt. And, Constable Hemlock added, a triumphant gleam in his eye, we've also confirmed that Mr. Finch was indeed heavily indebted to Mrs. Cavendish, a rather large sum due next month. Her death, while tragic, would certainly alleviate that particular pressure for him, wouldn't it? It was a small revelation, but a significant one. The locket, the mysterious portrait, Alistair Finch's debt, the threads were beginning to tangle into a complex knot, and Miss Marple sensed that the seemingly simple heart attack was anything but. Chapter 6. Whispers of the Past. The village was now abuzz with theories, each more elaborate than the last. The police, led by the astute Inspector Slack from the county, were meticulously sifting through the evidence, but the locket and its mysterious occupant remained a perplexing enigma. Miss Marple, however, had a feeling about the locket. It spoke of a deeply personal history, of secrets long buried. She decided to pay a discreet visit to Dr. Ashworth. The doctor, a man of quiet integrity, had been a contemporary of Mrs. Cavendish, their lives entwined since childhood. Over a cup of tea, not the late Mrs. Cavendish's brew, but a sturdy Ceylon, Miss Marple gently guided the conversation towards the past. "Reginald," Miss Marple began, her voice soft, "you knew Evelyn for so many years. She was a woman of strong character, but do you recall anything, any youthful indiscretion, perhaps, that she might have kept hidden?" Dr. Ashworth sighed, stirring his tea thoughtfully. "Evelyn was always a private woman, Jane, and rather proud. But there was a young man, many, many years ago, before she met her late husband, a very handsome, dashing fellow named Thomas Redding. He was an artist, passing through St. Mary Mead. Evelyn, then a girl of 20, was quite smitten. They had a secret engagement, I believe. He gave her a locket, much like the one found, but then He simply vanished. No one ever knew why. Evelyn never spoke of him again, as if he'd never existed. It was a great scandal at the time, though quickly hushed up. Miss Marple's eyes lit up. Thomas Redding? And the locket contained his portrait? So it was rumored, Dr. Ashworth confirmed, a wistful look in his eyes. He was a good-hearted fellow. I always wondered what became of him. Evelyn was heartbroken, though she'd never admit it. She rebuilt her life with Cavendish and locked that part of herself away. The description of Thomas Redding, dark, intense eyes, romantic hair, perfectly matched the miniature in the locket. This was a significant breakthrough. The locket was not just an old trinket. It was a relic of Mrs. Cavendish's buried past. But why would she be carrying it, or even wearing it, on the day of her death, after decades of silence? It implied that something from that forgotten chapter of her life had resurfaced. Miss Marple's thoughts immediately turned to Miss Beatrice Thorne. Miss Thorne was of a similar age to Mrs. Cavendish. Could she have known Thomas Redding, or perhaps a member of his family? Miss Thorne's extreme nervousness, her desperate attempts to avoid discussing the locket, suddenly made more sense. Her anxiety wasn't just about Mrs. Cavendish. It was perhaps rooted in this shared, unspoken history. As she walked home, Miss Marple pondered. She passed Cavendish Manor, and her gaze almost instinctively fell upon the gardens. Mr. Silas Croft, the new gardener, was tending to a flower bed, his back to her. He was meticulously arranging a cluster of deep purple blooms Miss Marple didn't recognize. They looked exotic, beautiful, yet carried an odd, almost sinister quality in their intense color. As she watched, Mr. Croft straightened up and glanced, around his gray eyes scanning the manor house with that same unsettling watchfulness. His gaze lingered particularly on the drawing-room window, where the tragedy had unfolded. It was a subtle detail, but one that raised a fresh wave of suspicion in Miss Marple's mind. The past, she realized, was not always buried, but sometimes cultivated. Chapter 7. A Shadow in the Garden. The village continued its slow, painful process of grappling with Mrs. Cavendish's demise. The police, having confirmed the presence of a potent, fast-acting poison in Mrs. Cavendish's system, a highly toxic alkaloid, were now operating under the assumption of murder. The locket, with its portrait of Thomas Redding, remained a puzzling, albeit fascinating, lead, pulling the investigation into the murky depths of Mrs. Cavendish's long-buried past. Miss Marple, however, was drawn to a different, more immediate detail: Mr. Silas Croft and his mysterious flower beds. The deep purple flowers, so distinctively sinister, had captured her attention. She had a profound, almost encyclopedic knowledge of plants, having spent countless hours in her own garden and poring over botanical texts. She felt certain she had seen or read about those particular blooms before, not for their beauty, but for their dangerous properties. The next morning, she made a quiet visit to Mrs. Henderson, the village's unofficial herbalist, a kindly woman with an unparalleled knowledge of local flora. "My dear Mrs. Henderson," Miss Marple began, "I wonder if you could identify a plant for me. It has deep purple, almost black, bell-shaped flowers, and it's rather new to the Cavendish Manor gardens." She described the plant in detail. Mrs. Henderson's eyes, usually twinkling, grew serious. "Ah, that sounds like Atropa belladonna, Miss Marple. Deadly nightshade, some call it. A very potent plant. All parts are poisonous, especially the berries and leaves. Even the pollen can be dangerous. A powerful sedative in small doses, but in larger quantities it can cause paralysis, heart failure, a very quick, quiet death if prepared correctly." She shuddered slightly. "It's not a common garden plant, Miss Marple. Not in these parts, not unless someone knew exactly what they were doing with it." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Henderson, her mind racing. Deadly nightshade, a powerful alkaloid, the very type of poison the police suspected, and it was being cultivated with meticulous care by Mr. Silas Croft, the new gardener, who had that unsettling, watchful gaze. Later that afternoon, as Miss Marple was taking her constitutional walk, she observed a hushed, intense conversation unfolding at the edge of the Cavendish Manor grounds. Miss Beatrice Thorne, looking more agitated than usual, was speaking in urgent whispers with Mr. Silas Croft. Their heads were close together, their voices low, but the tension between them was palpable. Miss Thorne wrung her hands, while Mr. Croft's face was grim, his eyes darting towards the manor house with a renewed intensity. It was clear they knew each other, and their connection was not a casual one. Miss Thorne, who had seemed so terrified of Mrs. Cavendish, was now openly consorting with a man cultivating a deadly poison on Cavendish's very grounds. A shocking thought solidified in Miss Marple's mind. She remembered Miss Thorne's unusual age, her nervousness, her denial about the locket. If Miss Thorne had known Thomas Redding, perhaps Mr. Croft was also connected to that distant past. It was a long shot, but Miss Marple had seen stranger coincidences. The next day, Inspector Slack shared a piece of information with Miss Marple, not quite a revelation, but a confirmation that made Miss Marple's own suspicions coalesce. "We've managed to trace Mr. Silas Croft, Miss Marple," the inspector announced, a flicker of excitement in his usually stoic eyes. "He's been quite elusive. Turns out he has a rather checkered past, but more importantly, he is indeed Miss Beatrice Thorne's estranged brother. Vanished from the district years ago after some family trouble. Never heard from again until now. And he's been working here for only a few weeks." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. An estranged brother cultivating poison, newly arrived and in hushed conversation with the companion. The connection to the past, she realized, was not merely through Mrs. Cavendish, but through Miss Thorne and her own hidden family secrets. The plot was thickening, layer by layer, revealing not just one mystery, but several intertwined tragedies. Chapter 8. The Weight of Secrets. The revelation of Mr. Silas Croft being Miss Thorne's estranged brother sent a ripple of fresh speculation through St. Mary Mead. Constable Hemlock, initially baffled, now saw a clear, if rather melodramatic, motive: a family vendetta. Miss Marple, however, sensed a deeper, more painful story beneath the surface. She felt a profound empathy for Miss Thorne, who had borne the brunt of Mrs. Cavendish's whims for so long. Miss Marple decided it was time for a more direct, yet still gentle, approach with Miss Thorne. She found the companion in the conservatory, watering Mrs. Cavendish's prized orchids, her movements slow and listless. "My dear Beatrice," Miss Marple began, her voice unusually soft, "I know this is a difficult time, but secrets, when held too long, can become a terrible burden. Perhaps it is time to unburden yourself." Miss Thorne flinched, dropping the watering can with a clatter. Tears welled in her eyes, and her fragile composure finally shattered. She sank onto a wicker chair, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all so dreadful. I never wanted any of this." "Silas, he's so changed." Miss Marple waited patiently, offering a clean handkerchief. After a few minutes, Miss Thorne, her voice choked with emotion, began to speak. "Mrs. Cavendish, she was not always as she seemed. Many years ago, when Silas and I were children, our father, a humble clerk, was accused of theft. Mrs. Cavendish's late husband, then a magistrate, presided over the case. But it was Evelyn. Evelyn supplied the evidence. Our father was ruined, disgraced. He died shortly after. Silas, in his despair and anger, ran away, swearing vengeance. We thought him gone forever." "And Mrs. Cavendish?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "She knew our father was innocent," Miss Thorne whispered, her eyes wide with pain. "She knew, but she had a grudge against him for some trivial matter, and she held power. She manipulated the evidence. And when Silas disappeared, she sought me out. offered me a position as her companion, but it was never kindness, Miss Marple. It was a form of blackmail. She threatened to expose Silas, to ruin what was left of our family name if I ever spoke a word. She kept me here, a prisoner, in all but name, for decades. Miss Marple's heart ached for the poor woman. And Silas returned? Yes, just a few months ago. He had heard Mrs. Cavendish was ailing, and he came back full of his old bitterness. He swore he would make her pay. He demanded to be hired as a gardener, to be close. I begged him not to do anything foolish, but he was so full of hate. He started cultivating the deadly nightshade. He told me it was an interest, a hobby. I never truly believed he would use it. Miss Thorne's voice broke again, but he did speak of it often. How easy it would be, how untraceable. Did he give Mrs. Cavendish the poison? Miss Marple asked, her voice firm. Miss Thorne hesitated, then shook her head vehemently. No, I swear. No. He spoke of it, yes, but he said he wouldn't. He wanted her to suffer, not to die quickly. He wanted to ruin her reputation, not just end her life. He said he had a different plan for the tea party, to expose her past cruelty to the entire village. Her eyes darted around as if Silas might appear from the shadows. He was so angry when she died so quickly. He said it ruined his plans. It was a profound confession. The locket, the portrait of Thomas Redding. It had been a red herring, or perhaps, Miss Marple realized, a piece of Mrs. Cavendish's past that had become tangled in the present. Miss Thorne's story opened up a new vista of motives, deeply personal and tragically old. But if Silas didn't administer the poison, who did? The pieces were falling into place, but the most crucial one was still missing. The true killer remained hidden in plain sight, obscured by the weight of these long-held secrets. Chapter 9. The Missing Piece. The confession of Miss Thorne, while horrifying, brought a strange sense of clarity to Miss Marple. The village, with its outwardly genteel facade, concealed layers of long-held grievances and bitter resentments. Silas Croft's return, fueled by a desire for vengeance against Mrs. Cavendish for his father's unjust ruin, explained the deadly nightshade in the garden and his menacing presence. But if he wasn't the murderer, then the focus had to shift back to the drawing-room on that fatal afternoon. Miss Marple returned home, her mind meticulously replaying the events of the tea party. Every gesture, every word, every subtle shift in expression. Mrs. Cavendish's imperious demeanor, Alistair Finch's nervous energy, Mrs. Plum's thinly veiled disdain, Dr. Ashworth's quiet resignation, and Miss Thorne's palpable fear. And then, the moments immediately before the collapse. Mrs. Cavendish had taken her teacup, added sugar, stirred, and then sipped. It was during that brief interval, just before the fatal sip, that Miss Marple remembered a small commotion. Alistair Finch had been near the tea trolley, talking with a village elderly lady about her failing rose bushes. But just as Mrs. Cavendish reached for her tea, Alistair had made a slight movement towards the table, ostensibly to offer more sandwiches to the lady, but his hand had lingered near the sugar bowl, and he had exchanged a few low, intense words with Mrs. Cavendish. Miss Marple remembered it clearly now. Mrs. Cavendish had given him a look of pure contempt, a cutting retort barely audible over the general hum of conversation. "You truly are despicable, Alistair," she had hissed. "Why the locket, then?" Miss Marple had initially believed it to be connected to Thomas Redding, a relic of Mrs. Cavendish's past, somehow resurfacing. But Miss Thorne's testimony had complicated this. If the locket was so old, and Mrs. Cavendish never wore it, why would it be near her hand at the moment of her death? It couldn't have simply fallen from her person. She wasn't wearing it, unless it wasn't a sentimental relic, but something else entirely. Something Mrs. Cavendish had produced in her final moments. Miss Marple suddenly recalled Alistair Finch's nervous adjustment of his jacket after Mrs. Cavendish collapsed. Had he been trying to conceal something? A chilling thought struck Miss Marple. The locket wasn't about the past lover. It was about money. Alistair Finch's desperate financial situation was well known. Mrs. Cavendish had been taunting him about his meager inheritance and his extravagant ways just moments before she died. What if the locket contained not a romantic portrait, but something far more damning? Inspector Slack, after further investigation, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, looking both grim and triumphant. "Miss Marple, we found something rather interesting. Inside the locket, beneath the miniature of Thomas Redding, there was a tiny, folded piece of paper, so minute, almost invisible. It contains a ledger entry, written in Mrs. Cavendish's distinctive hand, detailing several substantial, indeed illegal financial irregularities involving Mr. Alistair Finch's trust fund. It also references a specific document, a promissory note signed by Finch, which, if made public, would not only ruin him financially, but also expose him to serious legal charges. Alistair Finch had not just owed Mrs. Cavendish money, he had been engaged in outright fraud with her estate, and Mrs. Cavendish, Miss Marple realized, had been using the locket as a threat, a final public humiliation for her spendthrift nephew. She had drawn it out, revealed its contents to him, perhaps even waved it at him, right there at the tea party just before she took that fateful sip. It was an act of extreme cruelty, typical of Mrs. Cavendish. And Alistair, cornered and desperate, had acted. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a terrifying precision. The locket was indeed a clue, not of love, but of blackmail. The poison, the subtle shift, the financial desperation, the hidden history of the village, it all coalesced into a single horrifying truth. The killer was not a vengeful gardener or a long-suffering companion, but someone far closer, someone driven to the edge by greed and desperation. Chapter 10. The Quiet Revelation. The drawing-room of Cavendish Manor, once a stage for polite society and then for tragedy, was now set for the final act. Inspector Slack had gathered all the principal players: Miss Marple, Dr. Ashworth, Miss Thorne, Mrs. Plum, and a noticeably pale and twitchy Alistair Finch. Constable Hemlock stood by the door, his expression grave. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence punctuated only by the distant caw of rooks. Miss Marple, seated in her customary armchair, her hands calmly resting in her lap, observed them all. Her mild blue eyes seemed to hold the weight of all human folly, all the complexities of the heart. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have made significant progress in our investigation into Mrs. Evelyn Cavendish's death. While there were many threads, Miss Marple has, with her unique insight, helped us unravel the truth." He gestured to Miss Marple. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Indeed, it has been a sad business, revealing how much pain and resentment lay beneath the surface of our quiet village. Mrs. Cavendish, a woman of formidable character, had, over the years, created many enemies. Miss Thorne's brother, Mr. Croft, had a very strong motive for vengeance, rooted in a tragic injustice from the past, and the presence of the deadly nightshade in the garden certainly pointed a finger in that direction." She paused, allowing this to sink in. However, the immediate cause of Mrs. Cavendish's death was not from Mr. Croft's plants. It was a fast-acting alkaloid poison delivered precisely and subtly. And the motive, while connected to the past, truly ripened in the present. Miss Marple then turned her gaze directly to Alistair Finch. "Mr. Finch, you were deeply in debt to your aunt, and not just in a simple financial sense. You had been engaging in fraudulent activities with her estate, and she possessed irrefutable proof of this. A tiny ledger entry and a reference to a promissory note hidden within the silver locket." Alistair Finch's face blanched. "Preposterous! I loved my aunt." "You did not, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple stated quietly, her voice unwavering. "You were desperate." On that afternoon, Mrs. Cavendish, in a final act of cruelty, produced that locket. She was threatening to expose you to the entire village, to ruin you completely. She even called you despicable in a low voice, just as she was reaching for her tea. "No," Alistair protested, his voice rising. "It's a lie." "It is not," Miss Marple continued calmly. "You were near the tea trolley, supposedly offering sandwiches, but I observed you. As Mrs. Cavendish reached for her teacup, you subtly leaned forward, your hand briefly obscured by the sugar bowl. It was then, Mr. Finch, that you seized your opportunity. The poison was not in the tea nor in the cup. It was in a specific lump of sugar. You had brought it with you, knowing Mrs. Cavendish's habit of taking 2 specific lumps. You switched. The sugar tongs, or perhaps simply ensured the poisoned lump was the one she took, during that brief, almost imperceptible moment of distraction when she was taunting you with the locket. The locket, in her final grasp, fell as she collapsed, a direct result of your desperate act to silence her. Alistair Finch staggered back, his composure finally shattering, his face contorted in a mask of fear and rage. You old hag, you know nothing." "I know human nature, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple replied, her gaze steady, "and I know desperation when I see it." Constable Hemlock stepped forward, his hand resting on Alistair Finch's arm. "Mr. Finch, you are under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Evelyn Cavendish." Alistair Finch crumpled, his bravado evaporating as he was led away. Miss Thorne wept silently, a mixture of grief and relief. Mrs. Plum looked on, her face a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction. Miss Marple watched him go, a profound sadness in her eyes. Another life ruined, another soul lost to the darkness of greed and resentment. The quiet gardens of St. Mary Mead had once again witnessed a tragedy that echoed the very worst of humanity, and once again her extraordinary intuition had brought the truth to light. Thank you for watching this tale unfold. We hope you will join us again for another Miss Marple mystery.